Good morning, everyone. Let's begin. So welcome everyone to the Just Transition Financing Mechanism, Local and International Experiences and Perspectives. My name is Shalmini Harrington. I'm one of the commissioners, and I have the privilege of chairing the financing workstream. So over the past year or so, we've been busy developing a Just Transition Financing Mechanism for South Africa. And it's been a difficult task, so today we are going to spend some time to hear what others are doing and maybe enrich our own working experience. I do want to preface some of what we are doing and why we are doing it, particularly from the finance perspective. The aim of the Just Transition, number one, is to ensure that risks and opportunities in the transition are equitably distributed and to maximize human development outcomes. The PCC sees the Just Transition Project as a multi-dimensional initiative that combines climate action with targeted support to vulnerable workers and communities, as well as marginalized groups. We've heard about the three justice concepts. Just transition projects, first and foremost, need to meet those justice concepts. We need projects to be procedurally just. They should be developed through a bottom-up approach. And number one, first and foremost, they must be inclusive. We must also have a distribution of benefits and risks. And also, we must aim to redress some of the historical issues we deal with. In South Africa, we are faced with inequality, poverty, unemployment. We know this well, but we have a huge opportunity. In decarbonizing, we can build in the ways to address this, and that is exactly what we need to do. But we have a big challenge. The financing does not always get directed to just transition projects. We know this. Just transition projects, high risk, they are not commercially viable, and they need us to have deliberate action. We need to funnel this money towards these projects so we can get these benefits that we know we can. So this is what we're trying to do within the Finance Working Group. We're really trying to redress these problems and actually sort of reimagine how financing flows can move towards the critical areas we need it to. So with that, I'm now going to hand over to Deepak to take you through some of the work we're doing, but also I look forward to the robust discussions, and please feel free to weigh in. We want this to be interactive. So thank you, everyone. Over to you, Deepak.
Thank you so much, Shamini. For those of you who don't know, Shamini is the executive Vice President at Sasol, besides being a commissioner at the PCC, and she is at the heart of understanding what a just transition should look like, as in this case, corporates as well as an entire country shift towards a lower carbon economy, but as we do that, to ensure that what we create and build is a climate resilient society and alternative livelihoods for people. My presentation is a little dense, so I'll leave you to read it while I wax lyrically about what we've attempted to do in taking us essentially from an enunciation of a very deep and committed set of principles that are contained in our Just Transition Framework, now adopted by Cabinet as the national statement of principle and strategy that needs to accompany our climate response. And this is so important to understand because our just transition is not only about being climate responsive, but it is taking advantage of the opportunities and guarding against the risks that are associated with a decarbonization journey that we have committed to as a country through our very ambitious revised nationally determined contributions, which we lodged in 2021. As colleagues also know, that set the stage then for the first of what is now known as JET-Ps and JET investment plans. However, as much has been said about what these pathways look like, one of the evasive issues in this transitioning has been the elephant in the room. What does justice mean as we undertake this transition? And I think a lot of speakers have eloquently, over the last 2 years, unpacked either in intellectual or in literature terms or in analytical terms what the imperative for justice is. But we are yet to see practical steps towards ensuring that we move from lip service to action on the ground in the communities that are going to be, in the first instance, be impacted by, in our case, the coal transition, and in a more medium to long-term way, impacted by climate change that actually takes place. We have, during the course of the last year, as the Presidential Climate Commission, on the back of both the Just Transition Framework as well as the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, made a concerted attempt to look at what this means for our own domestic as well as international financial markets, to look at the current financial barriers, as well as, we would hasten to add, some of the market failures to provide adequate capital at scale to ensure that the justice components that include improved livelihoods, that include redress for workers, that include alternative economic systems in local areas as the transition unfolds. What does it mean to ensure that we find the mechanisms through which, regardless of ticket size, as we know is an issue, regardless of what might appear to be uncommercial and therefore unviable returns, how do we close these gaps, particularly in the face of a, now we understand, scarcity of grant and deeply concessional funding that might be available. The research has looked at how we can catalyze through action now rather than wait for a wholesale change in the architecture either of our domestic financial system, or, as some of us know, the conversations that are happening in the multilateral as well as the global space about the need to fundamentally alter, change, and reorient the financial architecture. And then we all know that unless we organize and systematize for action, very little gets done, and therefore we are also, in the course of this project, looking at what are the institutional and governance arrangements that need to be put in place, not only to ensure effective implementation and achievement of outcomes, but also to ensure that there's confidence and there is trust by all players in the capital and financial markets to be able to trust that we are in fact aligned, that we can in fact, on the basis of that trust and confidence, begin to harmonize, integrate, and scale up the finance that is required, the project development, conceptualization, and organizing capability that is required, the project aggregation that we know is at the heart of scaling up our implementation plans. There are more slides in the pack, which I am going to take an executive decision not to flight. Having said that, let me pause at this point and ask our very experienced, eloquent, seasoned, and in the case of Salim, enlightened panel to perhaps respond from their perspective of what this means, not only in South Africa, but also firstly in the sub-region and the continent in Africa, but also what are the emerging issues, what are the emerging challenges in the rest of the world, as particularly the developing world grapples with the issue of climate transitions, which need to accompany in a deep way their own socio-economic pathways development. I'm going to, in no particular order, but introduce Hayley St. Dennis, who is head of Just Transitions at the Institute for Human Rights and Business, or in business. She guides the work on the just transition elements at the IHRB, and herself convened a really effective panel looking at multi-country issues facing just transition endeavors. So, Hayley, I would like you perhaps to reflect not only on the outcomes of your own panel, but the work that you have been doing in a very deep way that looks at multi-party and business as an imperative for pursuing a just transition. Hayley, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Deepak. And I'm so incredibly humbled to be here at this really exciting and very impressive launch. And I also want to put a warning label on anything I say to flag that I am by no means an expert on blended finance mechanisms. So the imposter syndrome is also very real. But I think we're all waking up to the fact that we need to all become expert very, very quickly. So I am bringing that business and human rights perspective, which actually aligns really well with the JTFM's core focus on not reinventing the wheel, not creating glossy new mechanisms for the sake of it, but actually really focusing on efficiency and aligning existing funds and mechanisms across that spectrum of capital, and really interrogating how to leverage all the fruit hanging around us to the maximum. So one piece I just wanted to pull out was around the PMUs and JTFM's new focus around CSR and ESG funds as a particularly underutilized vehicle that could be redirected, I think, in a much more strategic way. But I think coupled with that needs to be really clear incentive and even mandatory expectation around the need for business to actually price in the sort of social transition risk. And that, I think, to some extent would really address that scarcity point you brought in already, Deepak. And we did have another great session yesterday, in addition to that multi-country one here in the Pavilion, looking at how to deploy that existing suite of corporate social performance standards that already exist to the fullest. And we had Sue Lund from the PMU, we had Shamila Subramani from the NBI, and we had Claude Kamemba from Southern Africa Research Watch. So really reflecting that sort of cross-section of the government, private sector, and civil society ecosystem that is very live and at play in this question. And one sort of nugget that came out of that was that the magnitude of loss we will experience in the transition will directly correlate to how orderly the transition is. And business is going to be the vehicle for order or disorder, depending on how it's wielded. And we know that for decades, if not centuries, the impacts on workers, communities, consumers, and others have been externalized by business. And that our market failure is a reflection of the true cost of business not actually being priced in. And so the just transition, from our perspective, really presents that opportunity to rethink business models. And I think one really transformative concept, really at the heart, I think, of what you're exploring and experimenting with is around the role and responsibility of the private sector to actually value the J. And we have some sense of what it costs business if they don't do this. There's a really great 2013 study from the University of Queensland that looked at the costs of company-community conflict at hydrocarbon extraction sites. And it found that the cost of that conflict could cost as much as $10,000 a day during initial exploration, $50,000 a day during advanced exploration, and $20 million per week during full-blown operations. And so those are incredibly motivating figures to business, and if anything, will only rise with the sort of wave of transition mineral mining that was to come. But I think they could also be extended to the full suite of renewables technologies to ensure that transition in also doesn't become just as extractive. So I think final point to say is what that study missed, and I think what this really excitingly is starting to get into, is around an evaluation of the positive value and opportunity for business to actually engage meaningfully in social dialogue with workers, with communities, and to really, I think, invest in that ignored third pillar of restorative justice. And so I guess if there was a key message from me in reviewing the JTFM and where I think the innovation is headed, it's to ensure that those social dimensions from private actors are priced in. Price it in, price it in, price it in.
Thank you so much for those perspectives, Haley. Business has to make a move from seeing justice as part of its CSI and start seeing what you call an embedded and therefore taken into account cost of not engaging in socially just transitions. Our next speaker is Salim. Salim, you only have 5 minutes. Salim is the executive director of the African
3 minutes and I would have gone to 5.
of the African Climate Foundation. And while initially starting up your work, both regranting as well as advanced thought processes, and it seems now into active advocacy from what we can garner as you foray onto the rest of the continent, I think you're well placed to look at what a just transition means, not only in South Africa's context, but also in the differing contexts of African countries in particular, as they face different sets of realities of what this continent, South Africa excluded, has made such a minuscule contribution to carbon as well as greenhouse gas emissions over the course of industrializing history, but is now being asked to also make a contribution to this process. What are your perspectives?
Sure.
Firstly in South Africa and then on the rest of the continent with respect to what justice actually means for just transitions. Thank you.
My 5 minutes will be taken up just on South Africa. Just very quickly, I just want to share more philanthropic perspective, and just to also mention that very recently, Akia Foundation has put up a $20 million fund to look at these kinds of issues. I served on the steering committee of the JFTM. I think what we have to be clear is that it's not a fund. It's a mechanism to align different interests, different projects. I think as where we are sitting, one of the challenges we are sort of curious about is there could be a risk of misallocation of grant funds. And so how do we reduce the risk of that? And what kind of groundwork do we need to do to ensure that the funding, this is a big issue for philanthropists, is where is the money going to go to? It can't go to big consulting firms because that's a real issue. We have to find ways in which real needs are matched with the ability to supply the necessary funding. It's not just funding, but other capabilities that we have to take into account, that these are non-tangible type of contributions to initiatives that would unlock new social enterprise opportunities on the ground to meet the sort of impact requirements around not only ESG but also the just aspects of it. Some thoughts on that would be to really look at a sort of umbrella development framework for Mpumalanga, because I know we are considering supporting. There's a big program to support the development in Mpumalanga. And I think that framework of bringing different stakeholders together to say, how do we, if we phase out coal, there are going to be losers. Not all the jobs are going to come from the JTP. I think we have to be realistic about that. Not every wind turbine is going to create jobs. After installation, the jobs are less. And the challenge we have is being able to replace the quantum of jobs and the longevity of jobs that a coal mine can produce. For example, coal mines last for 30, maybe 50 years. You've got to replace it with something equivalent. And that also will only be able to capture some levels of job. They have to be fair, decent. So we have to look at other opportunities. There's a lot of land there that is locked up in the mining industry and other places. So I think a guidance from an overarching development plan that can sort of provide a pathway to what kinds of initiatives would make sense, what are the challenges to realizing those initiatives, and which ones of them can be fast-tracked and accelerated with the available funding that we have. How much more work needs to be done to stimulate others? And I think it's more about a cluster of initiatives that can then have a snowball effect and a momentum. So this thing about an alternative development opportunity and model in the coal mining areas, this is where I think a lot of the current stakeholders that own assets in the area need to be brought on board. Number two is that allows us to think through in a less fragmented and a more coordinated manner. And thirdly, hopefully that will reduce the risk of misallocation. Grant money is scarce. You're not going to get another opportunity if you waste it. And so we have to be very strategic of how we use it. And we can leverage more on a block of initiatives that test the ground. So maybe I'll leave it there. Thanks. Was that 5 minutes?
You've given me 30 seconds to speak. Thank you for that, Salim. I think we must unpack those issues that you've raised about, on the one hand, allowing markets to respond of their own course and through what some would argue is a frictionless set of market operations. But we all know that there are market failures here. And you introduced the need to have alignment, coordination, integration, and I would imagine in technical terms that then leads to coordinated blending of limited resources that allow these projects to realize themselves. I want to now turn to Neil. Neil, you've been at the heart of what used to be a novelty, now a critical challenge of South Africa's just energy transition investment plan adopted by Cabinet, and then more recently, the implementation plan that wants to give effect to it, also adopted, if that's the right word, by Cabinet. And you and the PMU team now have the challenge of making this happen. We all know that the pledge, which you might want to talk about, that was made in Glasgow and now supplemented by a few other additional players, takes us from 8.5 to maybe 12, but it's still far short of the entirety of the sum of $98 billion that is required just for the jet to 2030. How do we ensure that what limited grant and deeply concessional financing might be in the package, that we do not leave workers behind, that we do not leave societies, leave alone assets, stranded as this transition unfolds? And what are you doing as the PMU, at least what perspectives do you have about what the critical short-term challenges are to get this moving into practice?
Thank you, Deepak. I was going to speak about matchmaking, but Salim covered that quite well, and now you want me to speak about the implementation plan, which is going to be launched in the next session. So not much, but anyway. When I come across this group at many of the events in Mpumalanga. It's a group of community members that when they see me, they come across to me and they say they want to start a hemp farm. And they want to start this hemp farm on a abandoned mine or abandoned mining area. And it always gets me thinking so they have this idea. How do we get them to expand on this idea, to develop this idea into a project plan with a budget and with some idea in terms of what kind of expertise they may have to bring in, and also how this project is going to be run. And then how do we get to match this idea that they have and the further work that needs to be done in terms of support with financing and with limited financing. So I think issues around ensuring that the finance does get used for its intended purpose, especially with limited financing, is an important issue. A lot of that was then sort of brought into the collaboration that we did with the PCC in developing the idea of a just transition financing mechanism. And I think Chippy would remember it was one of my first things that I said as a member of the reference group is, so if we have this group in Mpumalanga that has this idea, how do we get them to get access to the kind of financing that is available? And there certainly is financing. I mean, there's some financing that we've had some difficulty in unlocking, but we believe that the grant financing can certainly be moved a lot faster. So in the implementation plan, and I'm not going to take Joanne's spotlight away from her, we have included a funding platform, and we set out in the implementation plan what that funding platform will entail. I think it sits very nicely within the PCC's Just Transition Financing Mechanism. And maybe, we should use it as a pilot and maybe make some mistakes from which the further development of the just transition financing mechanism can take lessons from. The plan is to have it in place by 2024. The strategy is to start off with a proof of concept, and certainly would want to be working very closely with other colleagues who are part of developing the financing mechanism, because the proof of concept is going to be about the feasibility. It is going to be about looking at the potential risk and how we can reduce that. It will be looking at, I suppose, the level of resources that we are able to attract into what is essentially a matchmaking mechanism. And then also, over the next, well, I suppose we into our summer vacation in South Africa. So I shouldn't be speaking about the next few months. To speak about sort of the first quarter of next year, to start building stakeholder confidence. And I think a lot of work would need to go also into building the confidence of the communities who are now the originators of these JET projects, that as they develop these ideas into projects with clear budgets, sort of clear plans, that we give them the confidence that the financing that we are speaking of matching, that does come through. Thank you, Deepak.
Thank you so much for that, Neil. Neil has announced that immediately after this panel is in fact a showcasing and almost literally a launch of the Just Energy Transition Implementation Plan that was very recently adopted by Cabinet as the practical expression of what everyone knew to be the JET IP, the investment plan. So those of you who have made other arrangements, please cancel them so that you can remain in this room after this panel.
The plan.
Yeah. Neil is head of, I think it's financial engineering, financial aggregation, financial mobilization, and capital markets persuasion at the JET IP project management unit, which sits within the presidency of South Africa. Next up is Catherine. Catherine, we've heard a lot about what the desirables are with respect to just transition, the need to ensure that it is embedded in all of our plans. Catherine is Group Executive of Project Preparation at the Development Bank of Southern Africa. I think being a fellow former commercial banker or investment banker, we both understand that waxing lyrical about something means that someone has to develop the capabilities, the structures, the blendedness, and the various project financing, either financial structures or plans, or develop projects to the point of implementation. You've had a very deep experience now in the context, for example, of infrastructure. For example, in the case of finding ways in which to develop as well as prepare projects for implementation, in this particular case in localities that might have distressed or stressed or incapable municipalities. And we all know if we are to get this just transition on the road, it's going to be implemented in local areas, and it's going to be implemented in specific communities that need to participate in the forging of their own futures. I would like you to spend a few minutes talking about what you see as the challenges in making this happen in reality.
Thanks, Deepak. I think for us, the challenge, the key challenge is that we are operating in a financial ecosystem which is not used to this type of funding to begin with. So Haley spoke about we might have to redefine pricing models to cater for this, but it's even a precursor before that, because some of these things can't be priced. It'll have to be grant funding, or deep concessional funding. So the Just Transition Finance Mechanism that Neil spoke about is really a platform that will do a number of things. We foresee it, first of all, crowding international pools of capital in the development capital space, other DFIs, MDB capital to support the just part of the transition journey that we have, and also local DFIs. The investment plan that has been approved by Cabinet is actually a plan that was crafted by a wide range of stakeholders in the South African community, including local DFIs. So, and with a differentiated mandate. So the pipeline, investment pipeline, speak to their mandate and what they can fund and what they can support. So they'll also have to be involved. We also foresee that philanthropic money will have to come to the party because a lot of this, as I said, won't be recoverable funds. Our biggest challenge with these type of projects or pipeline is that the ticket sizes are smaller, but the effort and the cost is very much still the same. So that's another challenge that we're going to have. The platform will do more than funding. It will be capacity building. It will matchmake pipeline to capital. But it will also bring together a mechanism for different stakeholders to ideate and design around what's already been conceived by the work done by the PCC and the work currently implemented by the PMU within the presidency. For us, we've got different models that we started to look at as a development institution. We are very comfortable. So I think for DBSA personally, we're comfortable with this project preparation space. We've been in it for a while. We've managed similar sort of prep funding platforms before. But we're really going to need coordination and partnership from the rest of the funding community to get this done. So Deepak, as you know, governance will be a big part of this. We can talk a little bit more about that, how we've implemented it ourselves. Governance will be a major part of this, and transparency, because many of these solutions will be bottom-up approaches of community engagement. They will be bespoke. The blended finance structures will be specific for that community and its needs. And we've got a number of examples where we've seen that works really, really well, where we focus largely on what is the financial impact, what is the development impact, what is the social impact, as we not only take care of the inequities in that community, as we close down carbon-intensive industries, but also ramp up the reduction of carbon emission industries and creating new green corridors in those areas that are affected.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I mean, it's clear that in enunciating a set of principles and strategic intentions, the rubber hits the road when it comes to project preparation, when it comes to creating the capacity in communities to be participants in their own futures, and the role of development finance institutions, philanthropies, as well as, I suppose, international donors, and we can talk about whether they really are coming to the party in reality or not, are going to be critical to ensuring that we get the scale as well as the capital or internal rates of return in individual projects or portfolios of projects to be able to find the financing. But equally, the project implementation is beyond financing, and I think you're saying that also requires a lot of attention. I'm going to, before opening up for questions to the panel broadly or specifically, I want to pounce on the person with the largest balance sheet in this room. He represents all of business, well, big business in South Africa. And I'd like Cass to explain to us, as he's heard what the panel has said, how he's going to bring his multiplicity of M3 and balance sheet capacity to bear on the just transition in South Africa. Cass, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Deepak. No, and thanks to the
panel for an interesting input. So let me say, so I'm CEO of Business Unity South Africa, the largest business organization in the country. And I'd better also just say that I chair the NBI, otherwise they'll kick me out of here. I don't think we're starting from a clean slate as far as collaboration and partnership between business and government is concerned, generally and in this area. So currently under the auspices of BUSA, we have a very robust partnership with government, including on energy. And we've actually raised funds to secure and donate expertise to the National Energy Crisis Committee, to implement the President's energy plan, and that's going reasonably well. So we need to, I think partnership has been mentioned here quite a bit, and we need to leverage off the partnerships we already have, and I think that's important. I think on things like the Just Energy Transition Partnership with the EU and US and others, business and government can work together to ensure appropriate projects are identified and put into place, and we actually leverage private sector funding in developing those projects and not just depend on the grant funding that we get. Business has been, I believe, at the forefront of transitioning to clean energy. I mean, we have the Sasol of this world, the Sibanias of this world, and others, Anglos, that are doing excellent work. But we also focus on the just transition. And I think the work that the NBI and BUSA have done with the Boston Consultancy Group on putting together a just transition document headed up by 30-odd CEOs that have been championing that, I think gives us some excellent data, excellent direction on the importance of business, looking at the just part of this transition, not just from a philanthropic or because we're good guys and good girls, but it makes business sense to do so in the long term. And I think one of the panelists said that we need to move, while ESG and CSR are important, we need to embed this in the architecture and structurally in business. And I think we can do that in South Africa. South Africa also has a pretty sophisticated financial sector. Don't need to tell you about that. And I think the sector can bring expertise and capacity to bear on things like blended finance, leveraging maximally investment, project finance, and so on, and innovate to respond to this particular challenge, because we do need to respond differently. And then finally, I think a number of panelists have mentioned that governance and transparency is critical, because we could actually build or fall on that, to be quite honest. And we would want to be party to actually ensure.
Thank you so much for that, Cas Kuvadia, Chief Executive of Business Unity South Africa, as he says, collectively probably the largest balance sheet in South Africa. And it is really heartening to know that we've moved from debating the need for just transition principles, just transition strategies, and very importantly, practical just transition mechanisms, giving practical expression to our already stated intent. And that's such an important changing of gears that is needed if we are to build confidence in communities, amongst workers, and all of society, that this just transition is in fact carefully thought through and is not intended to leave anyone behind. I'm going to open up the floor for very brief comments, but more importantly, perhaps questions for the panel. A hand up, in the second row, then I'll come to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, facilitator. My name is Tola Pagati from the South African Local Government Association. Enlightened gentlemen. What are the institutional mechanisms? What are the institutional arrangements for the implementation of the just transition? Because I heard the facilitator saying the cabinet has adopted an implementation plan. Now that presupposes that within that implementation plan, you would have institutional arrangements that defines access to financing. Thank you.
In front of you.
Good morning. I'm Togozile from Nkangala District Municipality in Mpumalanga, where coal and electricity comes from for most of South Africa. We have a challenge with just transition is not easily welcomed by the residents because they are, it is their bread and butter. Coal, they see it as a blessing from God that should not be taken from them. And from a side of a municipality, then we have to be in the middle and iron up issues that are coming, especially because we're at the district level with 6 municipalities that are beneficiaries from those coal mines. So my question would be like the one from Salga, but also to add saying, how do we get the community involved? How do we make sure that the person on the ground feels comfortable about just transition and also ensuring that they are able still to keep the bread on the table? Thank you.
Thank you for that. There was a hand here, and then I'll come to the back. Panelists, I'm assuming you're going to determine who will field those questions. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jeremy Buhai, and I'm from Nayan Consulting. We've been working with, we've worked with the African Development Bank on the Just Transition Initiative in Africa. We've been working with the Just Transition, Energy Transition Partnership in Indonesia for the Just Transition Framework with UNDP. And so just to give some sort of the landscape in Indonesia it's very similar. A lot of discussion has been made between South Africa and Indonesia, and there's a Kalimantan region where the mining is being anticipated to be phased out. And so we're really looking to the socioeconomic transformation and the economic diversification that has to happen afterwards. So kind of wanted to follow up on the matchmaking point about what has been done to identify potential projects for socioeconomic transformation and economic diversification. In our research, we came across this Mpumalanga Green Cluster Agency that has been doing a lot of analytical work to identify and quantify economic opportunities and job opportunities. So I wanted to see if there was any, how that's been used, or if any other things have been done to really nail down what kind of projects can be done to develop the region. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Hand at the back in the blue and gold shirt with parrots.
Thanks very much. My name's Connor. I'm from a company called Just Carbon, where we're training youth to measure carbon footprints. So while recognizing my bias, I'd like to ask, is my impression of the JETP correct that where it deals with youth in particular, the focus is almost entirely on upskilling and preparing them for new jobs? And if so, is there enough recognition that when it comes to the on-the-ground innovation that the JETP will require, are we empowering our youth to step up as a source for this innovation, especially when it comes to these financing issues, which are so complicated? How do we make sure that this doesn't become a barrier to youth innovation?
Thank you. I'm going to take that as the first round of questions. Hopefully we might have time for another round. But Neil, you go first.
Out of the blocks. So I think the worst answer to a question is it will be answered in the next session. So I'm not going to do that. So maybe it will just be for emphasis, especially the first two questions. So a project management unit was established early in 2023 to drive the implementation of the JET investment plan that was endorsed by Cabinet towards the end of last year. And it's the investment plan that was also tabled at the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh. How the structure works is that the PMU reports into a steering committee, and the steering committee is made up of government departments, a select number of government departments, sort of preferably at the level of DG, DDG, plus the PCC, and then we also have the DG from the Mpumalanga Premier's office that also serves on the steering committee. That steering committee then reports into an interministerial committee. So that's sort of the governance and the oversight of the implementation of the investment plan. The implementation plan that we finished just in time for the COP was approved by Cabinet a few weeks ago, and the details of the implementation plan and the roadmaps that are set out for each of the portfolios will be elaborated on in the next session. And I think it's going to, I mean, the trick is going to be identifying the various sources of financing, the various financing instruments, and the way in which instruments can be blended that can be put together as financing that is packaged and that is fit for purpose. And the funding platform not only going to be attracting grants, but also looking at, I mean, how do you develop that fit for purpose? Because I think some of these projects that are going to be identified, that's going to largely be about impact mitigation, that's largely going to originate from communities, are not projects that where grants are going to be the only type of financing for those projects. It may be that you start off with grants, but as you scale up the project, other forms of financing can also be invested to capitalize some of those scaling up of projects. I think there's a lot of common areas with Indonesia, but I think also fairly distinct features of the Indonesian investment plan, which they, I think, have finalized now, and we certainly, using every opportunity to share experiences, not only with Indonesia, but we're also looking at Vietnam, the Philippines, that is in sort of the starting stages of developing their own plan. And then we also have, closer to home, Senegal, that is working on an investment plan as an outcome of their JETP. And I think they're going to be very important lessons that we're going to be able to share as we embark on this really complex task where there are going to be lots of unknowns. And as I think has been said by the panel, there's going to be lots of firsts.
Thank you for that. Can I call on Catherine?
I thought I could add to some of what Neil was saying and answer some of the questions that was asked by the lady, as well as the gentleman, the young man from the back. So I think what's important for us, and to your question, we have started a concept called development labs, they D-labs, and what they focused on, they're 9 provinces at the moment, 7 provinces, 9 D-labs. 5 of them are operational already. But what they focused on is very much community-driven solutions. DBSA provides seed capital, starting off at about 70 million rands. The seed capital is to provide CAPEX, like building a facility, where young people in the community can come with different ideas. Entrepreneurs can come themselves with tech ideas, and we help them develop those. We also obviously train skills for the next economy, the green economy. But what's important is we try to partner them for at least 5 years, where we're intimately involved. And after 5 years, we do basically monitoring and just to see from a development perspective what the impact's been and what the learnings are. Initially, it was heavily focused on development impact. Now it's a combination of financial sustainability upfront and development impact. What's important about the D-Labs is that it is something that everybody can be involved in. It's completely driven bottom up. So if, the whole community can be involved, as well as other business partners. And we have formed various business partnerships in different provinces. In Mpumalanga specifically, we've partnered with Safcol and looked at the whole value chain, forestry value chain. And there are new business ideas that are coming from that we're also hoping to develop. In terms of the problem that you've been speaking about, I think that is one of the areas that we can probably connect you to and have further engagement on. But the D-Labs is one of those where I'm looking at this room, in deep pockets and people with lots of money in the room. I see my old Nedbank colleagues at the back too. We really need partnerships in these type of initiatives. I know it's not a natural place for commercial institutions, but it's not a lot of money to provide this type of seed capital, which will make a huge impact in the lives of those communities, that these changes that you're talking about are taking place.
Thank you for that, Catherine. We're going to be running out of time, so I'm going to ask Haley and Salim, respectively, to attempt a 1-minute wrap-up before I call on the Executive Director to give some closing remarks. Thank you.
I suppose the takeaway I've gotten from this and Indonesia and the other JETPs is that the J is much harder than the T in JETP. That is one of the early learnings so far. And so it'll be really important moving forward that we don't confuse pace with progress on that question, because we're not starting from a clean slate, and trust has been broken. And so I think inherent in that is a reality where human rights are too often treated as a benefit, right? These sort of basic ingredients for a dignified life have been given as scraps, if anything at all. And so the key to unlocking that is actually providing agency to these communities, because they have voice, but there will be a massive capacitation challenge to really ensure they're able to use it in the way needed, and a translation of all this complexity into something that's much more accessible. And I think likewise a capacitation of business, because justice is not a language business uses. But in the very unique South African context where you really are paving the way, and I very much agree, I think NBI and BUSA are really showing the world what that could look like for the rest of business. So I suppose that's the lesson I'd like to leave with.
Yeah, I think going forward, certainly where we sit, there are 4 things that we probably have to do very soon. And the JFTM work needs to build more work. The one is, where are the funds? So what are the specifics of the funds, the characteristics of the funds, who holds them? What are the conditions of those funds? We can't make assumptions that those funds can, just because you have a project, they're going to give you the funds. Second one is, where are the projects, and geographically, who are the proponents and sponsors of this? The characteristics of those projects, the risks, the bankability, the beneficiaries, the individuals, collectives, cooperatives. The third one is, where can we mobilize additional funds? Is it from philanthropies, impact funds, CSIs, the balance sheet of corporations, as you said, embedded? And lastly, people want to know where the funds went to. What was the result of those spend of those funds? So we need a tracking mechanism that has to be aligned to the investment plan. So those are the 4 things I would say.
Thank you, Salim. I'm going to now call Dr. Olver, the Executive Director of the PCC, to give very brief closing remarks. He might want to reflect on some of our Komati experience as contained in the Komati report. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepak, and a very good morning, everyone. Good to see so many of you, and thank you to our panelists. So we've been grappling with this idea of what is a just transition and how do we fund it. And I think we've had some really excellent reflections on that point. And we know that we're both managing a transition out of one kind of economy, with Mpumalanga as the ground zero for that transition. But we're also managing a transition into a new kind of economic activity. And there are huge opportunities as well as downsides and risks. People have mentioned the principles that inform this. So as South Africa, we've adopted a just transition framework. It talks about procedural justice involving people in a bottom-up way in the decisions that affect them. And we've also spoken about distributive and restorative justice. And we know that when we, trying to manage both the transitioning out from some sectors and transitioning into others, we want to be boosting economic opportunities, creating jobs and livelihoods, investing in skills, building community resilience, rehabilitating degraded land and water catchments and ecosystems. A lot of you have mentioned the particular challenges we face, the small ticket size of these projects, the fact that they take much longer to develop. They involve far more consultation and complex bottom-up processes. Their higher risk perception. Many of them are less commercial. They're not completely unbankable, but they have revenue streams that require a more patient form of capital. We've just done a report on tracking climate finance flows in South Africa. We're going to be launching it at 5 o'clock on Wednesday in this pavilion. Very interesting findings, but amongst the others, we know that just over 80% of money goes to mitigation, 12% goes to adaptation. We don't track just transition. It's not in the green finance taxonomies. We don't have an agreed way of measuring or tagging these projects. So, when we reflect about what we want a mechanism to do that, can drive finance into just transitions, we first of all want to provide clarity. So we want a clear way of tagging and understanding which projects qualify as just and which don't. We want to be able to invest in a pipeline because most funders tell us we want to fund these things, but we don't know how to find them. We do need matching, so we want to be able to link projects up with funders. We do need some creative financing, structuring and blending, and we do need to be able to track this and measure it over time. Now, there are quite a few proposals on the table. Dipak's about to launch a policy document on the subject, I think next week. The JET IP has got a chapter on a project finance platform. TIPS back in South Africa has done some really interesting and excellent work on this. And I know that Mpumalanga has been working on their own provincial-based clearinghouse mechanism. So there's a lot of proposals out there, and I think the next few months are going to be a really active period of debate and discussion as we try and sort of cohere around how to set up this mechanism, where should we set it up, what do we want it to do. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Dipak, for facilitating. Thanks to all of our panelists.